Now that's helpful, I think, because that gets us nearer to the book, which I was anxious to plug as Mr. Tyrrell is. His book is an attack on the left, with which I am prepared to associate myself. And I think we may have, though this may have been intensely boring for everyone to watch, I think we've cleared the ground in a sense. I mean, he's not really attacking Lyndon Johnson in this book. He's attacking the left. He's attacking the left that survived and came out of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, and the movement against the Vietnam War.
You say it, Mr. Who you're attacking.
Well, I mean, I don't see. I'm a much more peaceful man than you are, Christopher. I'm not attacking anyone. I'm merely describing what happened in the 1970s. And what happened in the 1970s was the breakdown of American liberalism into a riot of enthusiasms. And if you would like to read, perhaps we have some organ music. Bill, did you bring your harpsichord? Christopher's about to read.
I don't.
Harpsichord means very poor organ music.
I don't think that peaceful isn't a word I'm in search of. But if you say you don't attack anyone, how come that you say the vast majority of feminists were disagreeable misanthropes, horrible to behold, uncouth and unlovely? They were inferior women, contemptuous of the superior women, who through their charm and intellect have so often been able to establish such enviable lives for themselves. I could go on. I mean, I will if you like.
Go on, it's beautiful.
Why don't you plug your own book? I would say that was a critical...
I would say that was in my opinion, a clinical description.
Not elegant, but certainly not peaceful.
Just trying to point out, I know the difference between agreeable women and disagreeable women.
Well, yes, you have a number of roguish asides about yourself on this point, but you have a certain want of gallantry when you discuss the women's movement in general. One that I'm surprised in someone who is so fond of conservative affectations about the good old stylish days.
Here we are again.
Mr. Why are you anxious to say that you don't attack people? Because you do.
Well, I just would like to make one point here. This man has lived on terminological inexactitude. He's lived on the misnomers that came out of the 1970s because these misnomers make it easier for him to make the ideological points he wants to make. For instance, he just referred to the women's movement. And I suspect he doesn't blanch when he sees the New York Times refer to the National Organization for Women representing the women's movement. But of course, to be precise, the women's movement is a misnomer. It refers to some women's movement. Those women being
the
feminists. I mean, there is no such thing in this country as the women's movement. It doesn't in any way represent the women I associate with. The feminists don't in any way represent the happy-go-lucky women I associate with. And it doesn't represent the views of all those who voted for Ronald Reagan.
I'm sure that's true too.
So in other words, we got you again.
And I'm sure a woman would have to. be. Somehow I don't feel any sort of pain in my ribs. Perhaps I should have noticed.
He began by saying you were intimidated.
I know a rapier when I see one, and I know when I've been pronged.
Yeah, but
no, I'm sure I'm quite happy to grant you that a woman would have to be happy-go-lucky to associate with you. But if I said the women's movement, I don't mean to say that I don't recognize women as a sex, as well as a movement too. Terminological inexactitude is not what you meant to say, is it?
It's exactly what you...
It's a euphemism for what you intended to say. You want to call me a liar.
No, I wouldn't call you a liar, because I believe you are...
You know the provenance of the term.
Totally deluded.
You understand the provenance of the term.
No, I'm not going to call you a liar. I believe that you really and truly do believe these things. I've seen your performance in the nation.
I'll state my position if it's of any help to anyone. I wasn't living in America at the time, but I believe that the American left, American radicals, American liberals, many of them, in starting the civil rights movement for black Americans, in combating an unjust war in Indochina, and in beginning the emancipation of women, the way we think about sex, changed the way everyone thinks and the way everyone lives far beyond the borders of the United States. It was a tremendous time, and the whole world is in debt to the American left, I'd rather call it, for those three enterprises. Now, it's true that they're all now in rather low water, those movements, but I see no reason to sneer at them now or to forget the grand contribution they made, unsurpassed by any conservative rival.
Sneering is not the right word. I would use high indignation, and in one of the three you mentioned a moral sense of true shame to have guaranteed, as we did, that we would stand by the South Vietnamese and desert them is something which is plain shameful, not something you sneer about. Now let's take civil rights, because in Mr. Tyrrell's book he talks about how what we used to call liberals indeed insisted on something called equality. Equality of opportunity, and how in Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court of the United States said that it was un-American and indeed unconstitutional to take into account a person's race or color or creed in deciding whether somebody goes to the school or the other. Now, that has evolutionized. It's something called affirmative action and something now called quotas. That is viewed by Mr. Tyrrell and by a lot of liberals who endorsed the civil rights movement at that time, specifically, for instance, by Hubert Humphrey in a famous speech, something would never happen. And that is a distortion and, in fact, a return to a kind of racism, however involuted. Do you welcome what we call a distortion?
It's probably the worst. It's probably the worst single problem that we have on the left at the moment, because not only is it, as you say, known as or reminds people of quotas. I don't believe quotas is what it comes down to. It does involve a competition for scarce resources between two constituencies who've normally been on, as it were, our side, that's to say Jewish Americans and Black Americans, and this has meant that life on our wing of politics has been very tender. I don't believe that simply by legally abolishing discrimination you have abolished what led to it, the original singling out of Black Americans, the original meaning of discrimination, where they were always mentioned, quoted, counted, and restricted. By saying that now stops, you avoid any responsibility for the past, and you avoid the very tangled question of how we're going to make up for
you're making a
the inherited disabilities.
You make a cultural point. If you say, henceforth, it will be perfectly legal, as indeed it should be, for blacks to enter a restaurant, does not guarantee that every table will have one black and one white patron.
No.
And the point is that any laws that sought to bring that about would be laws which, if one would properly ground it philosophically, one would resist rather fiercely, certainly more fiercely than you have. Now, what about the business of the women's movement? I despise and am horrified by the sharp rise in family desertion. And it seems to me that there is abundant evidence to argue that there has been a correlation between the so-called women's movement and the neglect of children and broken homes.
The whole movement, as a matter of fact, has been a terrible failure. A few minutes ago you talked as though this has been a great success, what's happened to America. The truth of the matter is that a great many kids are, they're called latchkey children, and they live without parents. There's evidence that there's a high incidence of juvenile delinquency associated with these kids that are raised in homes without a father on the scene. And there's also evidence that right within the women's movement that some of these women who 20 years ago were telling the young ladies of America to go out and get careers, careers, not jobs, but careers, are now finding out that no, it didn't come out so well, and that the women ought to go back and establish friendly relations again with the opposite sex and have children and live the Ozzie and Harriet life once again. I would feel a little bitter if I were a 45-year-old woman who had given my life over to following the dictates of Betty Friedan, and finding out that Betty had decided that on second thought, perhaps the women of America ought to go back, these 45-year-old women ought to go back and become mothers again.
There's a very good book with a title in some way similar to yours, much better book, by George Dangerfield. It's called The Strange Death of Liberal England. It's a wonderful book. You may have read it. It's A.J.P. Taylor's favourite book. That may not commend it. That may not commend it.
You just live in a world full of cooks.
I mention it, you're very sweet to say so. I mention it for this reason. It's a wonderful evocation of pre-First World War Britain, when the old system, which was basically a liberal one, came under tremendous shocks from the movement for women's suffrage, the movement to disengage from Ireland, and the rise of organised labour. And in the chapter on the rise of women's suffrage, he describes beautifully all the morbid symptoms that appear when a long repressed, especially a sexually repressed group, begin to take their own measure. The suffragette movement, simply for women's franchise, for the right of women to vote, was attacked by all kinds of people for its weirdness, for the way that women started to dress as men, to neglect their families, to behave promiscuously, and many indeed of these symptoms, up to and including suicide on some occasions, were indeed present. But when the air cleared, one could see that that was the result of the original repression. And when you say that women are now, as it were, looking for better relations with the people with whom they broke off when they had to. You're making my point.
Sex.
That's a phase through which that movement had to pass.
You believe American women were repressed throughout the century?
If you read Barbara Ehrenreich's wonderful book, The Hearts of Men, socialist feminist book, you'll see which calls for, now that we have more terms of equality, she said, with which to negotiate, let's make a deal with the men. Half our children are going to be boys.
You don't understand.
We can't get along without them. Men and women get married, as she wittily points out, exactly the same numbers. Let's do it, but let's do it now, because now we're going to be taken more seriously.
You don't understand that throughout this century here in America, with the exception of black people, particularly in the South, that this has been a free society, do you? I mean, you think the Women's Christian Temperance Union, for instance, to mention one of the repressive movements that rose up and disappeared in this country, you don't believe that was dominated and run by women, do you? You think it was probably run by men, probably Buckley, the Buckley family.
I know there's a joke there that I've missed. I'm so
the joke. Had you read the book, you'd know it.
Read it with care. Prepared to quote from it again.
You'd know that the Women's Christian Temperance Union had enormous amount of political power in this supposed country that you feel repressed women in the first part of the century.
Or as you so brightly say, feminist demands are a horse laugh. The average American woman has actually controlled two bodies and sometimes more, usually by employing only one or two parts of her own.
Pretty good, eh, Christopher?
I'm so glad I didn't write it myself. The fact is, for your position to be even humorous, you'd have to say that all the women who felt themselves excluded from large parts of American life, underpaid or undervalued or underregarded, or in other ways taken for granted, were making it all up, that it was just a spree of neurosis.
You know,
these ladies going on about that must be what you believe. In fact, I think it's pretty evident that you do.
Let me talk about something else you said. You suggested that inevitably post-emancipation there is a period of exorbitant behavior, and one oughtn't to be surprised by this. And there's a certain sense in which what you say is not impossible to validate historically. When the Latin Americans fought to free themselves from foreign tyrants, they submitted to their own tyrants. Exactly the same thing has happened in Africa. We've taken a long, deep breath, 150 years have gone by, and a few nations in Latin America flirting with democracy. It hasn't quite happened substantially in Africa, but maybe it will in due course. It's certainly true that the whole notion that there would have to be oppression from the center after the socialist revolution tended for a long time to immunize Stalin, and before that Lenin, from the kind of criticisms which they had so abundantly earned. I maintain, however, that even if you are making a sociologically interesting point, what you are by no means doing is justifying any cessation of criticism during this interval. That is to say, if you do have a Colonel Idi Amin in exchange for the predecessor colonial power, the fact that you say, well, this kind of thing's going to happen before it involves democracy, does not say, therefore, you shouldn't be indignant about it or oppose it. And Mr. Tyrrell's thesis really is that let us indeed hope that some of the extremist feminists go back and behave and worry about things like families. But why can't we hasten that repatriation by sensible criticism?
Well, I don't think it was sensible criticism that I was just citing. I have no quarrel with your methodology at all. But in fact, Mr. Tyrrell is saying, just did say, that he thinks the whole thing was just a spree. It was all made up. It was promiscuity and exorbitance for its own sake. That there was that they had nothing to complain about. Now, your point, I think, is much more challenging for me because, I mean, you raised the whole question of emancipation and at what cost it comes in at, and you mentioned Amin
and necessary adolescent phase.
Yeah, the position we on the left keep finding ourselves in is the victims of a sort of three-card trick.